Hi everyone, it's Emily, and it's been a while since I've made one of these videos, but today I wanted to go over 3 games that I've recently completed. And don't worry, there won't be any spoilers in this. I'm just going to give some overall impressions and thoughts when it comes to these games and whether or not I recommend them. So these were all games that I completed in December, though technically this first one that I'm going to be talking about here, Trails from Zero, I mostly played in November, but I didn't reach the end screen until I think December 1st or 2nd. But I talked about Trails from Zero a lot on my channel already, and it was one of my most highly anticipated games for 2020. And now having played over 45 hours of this game, it's safe to say that this did not disappoint. So the Trails series can be quite intimidating to get into just because of how many games there currently are. And for the Western market, we've seen a large gap in localization, so it hasn't been until recently we've been seeing more accessibility to the series. Because I have talked about Trails quite a bit on this channel, I've had a lot of people ask me where the best place to start with the series, given just all the different entries on different platforms and whatnot. So honestly, you can start anywhere. I know there are a lot of dedicated fans that say the best way to approach it is chronologically, which I will agree. However, I think you could still get a lot of enjoyment starting wherever in the series, and if it captures your attention, you'll likely want to go back and play them all through. That all being said, I think Trails from Zero is actually a really great place to dive in for newcomers, as a way to see if you want to invest time in this very long series. This Crossbell arc is a little bit different from the Trails in the Sky and the Trails of Cold Steel in that you're part of the special police force that kind of tackles different missions throughout the town of Crossbell. One thing that I think Trails from Zero did particularly well was introduce us to some very endearing characters that you can't help but root for and want to learn more about them. Trails from Zero also have excellent pacing. Now, I think a lot of Falcom games have a really good balance when it comes to the combat as well as pacing in the narrative story. Out of all the first entries in the Trails story arcs, I think Trails from Zero does this the best, which is why I think this is a great game for newcomers to start with. Having played previous games in the series, I would say the combat was a little bit on the easier side for me when it came to upgrading weapons and the difficulty of all the enemies and whatnot. I found it was very easy to level up in this game and approach the narrative story without a lot of grinding. One of the other highlights I think of this game is how all the events basically take place in the city of Crossbell, with a few different areas you can explore in just outside the city limits. I think having the home base be in Crossbell just really helped me enjoy the atmosphere and the city itself and all the NPCs that always had something new to say whenever you approached them. So I just think that really enhanced my overall enjoyment of the experience and getting to know all the different city folk and the Crossbell town. And I think just one of the best things when it comes to the Trails games is just how charming the world is and all the characters. All the dialogue is written very well. I know a lot of people like to complain about some JRPGs that it's almost like you're reading a novel when you're playing them, but I just find just so much enjoyment and getting to know all the different characters and their quirks and all the different interactions that could happen in a given span of time. I think all the build-up and events that went on in this first game makes me very excited to finally get to Trails to Azure, which is coming out in a few months now. I'm still debating whether or not to do a video on my favorite games I played last year, but rest assured, Trails from Zero was definitely one of the top contenders of one of my favorite games that came out in 2020. Alright, so next we're going to be talking about AI, the Somnium Files, nirvanA Edition. So this is the sequel to AI, the Somnium Files that came out a couple years ago. But in no way do you really need to play that game in order to play the second game. However, with that said, I do want to encourage anyone who's interested in these visual novel mystery games to give the first one a go, because honestly, it's one of the best visual novels I've played to date. I did a little casual review after I finished it this past summer, if you guys are interested in more of my thoughts regarding that game. But for this video, I'll just be focusing on nirvanA Initiative. So nirvanA Initiative leaves off a few years after the events that happened in the first game, and with a whole new sort of mystery to unravel. And in this game, you don't actually play as the same main character as the first game, which, as I'll get into in a little bit, I'm a little disappointed about. Instead, there is a new police officer you play as, and you also play as Mizuki, who was one of the characters that was in the first game. So the big mystery in this game is that after participating in this kind of weird broadcasting TV station game show, this mysterious vertically sliced body somehow makes itself appear. And to make this story a little bit more complicated, they also fast forward the story a few years in the future within the prologue, showing that the other half of the same body also mysteriously appears. So the second game, you're looking at two different timelines of various events that are occurring, which is a little bit different from the playstyle of the first game, which had multiple different story arcs that all came together in the end to uncover what happened. And not to at all get into spoiler territory, but I really did like how the story unfolded in all of those kind of psychologically weird twists and turns that the creator of the Zero Escape and also the first AI Somnium Files is very known for. So it did keep me on the edge of my seat. However, I would say the overall impact of the story was a little bit to a lesser degree than compared to the first game, which I feel like totally blew my mind towards the end. I also found that the balance of humor in this second game was a little different from what we saw in the first game. The first game, you had the main protagonist make a lot of like dirty sexual jokes in a funny way, whereas in the second game, you don't have the protagonist really instigating the humor, but the characters around them are more inserting this humor, which for me, I felt like had a lesser impact than Date making them. And I will say that I really missed the banter between Date and Aiba, who were, again, the dynamic duo from the first game. They do make appearances in this sequel, but I kind of miss them being the star of the show, especially with their banter. So outside of the visual novel elements, this game also encompasses a lot of puzzle mechanics that the series and creator are known for. I will say when it comes to the puzzles, they're a little less satisfying to solve this time around. I feel like I was doing a little bit more of a linear path when solving them. However, there were a few puzzles that were a little bit less obvious that they sprinkled in there too. And a lot of those you had to fill in different word solutions rather than kind of finding them throughout the puzzle. At times I felt were kind of weird, so I'll admit that I did have to look up a few things just to progress the story because I didn't want to just be bogged down by a single puzzle that had some fill in the blank I had to figure out. So overall, I really did enjoy nirvanA Initiative. It did have that really good mind-bending story that I'm kind of looking for in these sort of games. However, I think because I did play the first game earlier last summer, I couldn't help but make comparisons when I was playing it. So it didn't leave as much of an impact on me as the first game. But I think it's still very much worthy to play if you played the first game or are in any way into detective sort of visual novels with some sci-fi and psychological thriller twists and turns. Now, there have also been hints of a third game coming out, which I'm very much looking forward to. And I'm really interested to see what sort of direction they decide to go for in that game. And finally, the last game I wanted to talk about today is Triangle Strategy. So this was the most recent game that I've completed after hearing just so much praise for it last year. And I would say that overall, I enjoyed the experience, but there are a few cons that I thought kind of weighed it down from making it an overall enjoyable strategy RPG. So the interesting aspect of this strategy RPG is that you have the ability to influence your allies to drive the narrative of the story in a particular path. So throughout the story, there'll be certain instances where you're kind of stuck in a dilemma of choosing what path to take. And so this would either be a split path where you decide to do one action versus another, or there might be 3 different possibilities to choose from. While I did appreciate how they really kept you on your toes with very high-stake dilemmas that you're part of in the story narrative, and you had the ability to actually choose where the characters go, there are certain times where I felt like it really didn't matter depending on what choice you chose. I'm sure you'll have sort of a different scenario play out, but I didn't feel like there were real repercussions for whatever choice you decide to go with most of the time. Now, I know that there are a few different split paths that the story can take, and so those particular choices mattered, but I felt like there were too many superficial scenarios that you're kind of pushed into making. And in the end, I felt like a lot of those choices didn't really matter because there is some creative way the narrative shaped to make everything all right and continue on in your journey. So I felt a little disappointed in that particular aspect. Now the combat here is what I think really shined in this game. I really liked how some of the attacks can shape certain aspects of the terrain. And I also liked the sense of depth that the maps had, which I think is severely lacking in games like Fire Emblem, which tend to be kind of just a flat terrain. I also thought there was a good variety of different characters with different abilities and special attacks. But I think when it comes to combat, what I disliked the most was the grinding. Whenever there's a pause in the narrative, where you could progress the story or choose to go back in the encampment, you have the ability to go into these mock battles to level up your characters. So I found it a little tedious to go into some of those mock battles over and over just to level up my characters to progress in the next part of the story, which was unfortunate. But I know that's a big aspect of a lot of these tactical games. And I know that definitely has an appeal for those who like to work on their stat building and create the perfect character and whatnot. But for me, I prefer the combat to sort of pace well with the narrative and not just be stuck grinding the same mock battles just to level up my party. For the side stories, I did find a few of them interesting, but a lot of them I could have done without. And I just saw myself skipping ahead in a lot of the text. And I know a big complaint about this game is all the text. And as someone who enjoys visual novels, I would say that some of the text did drag a bit. And I know a lot of these high fantasy, they like to play around with a lot of the dialogue to make it sound more kind of Shakespearean or something. And honestly, I thought it didn't really work all the time, especially not with the voice acting. So I found myself actually skipping a lot of the voice acting bits and just reading the dialogue instead of experiencing the scene as a whole. So overall, I did enjoy Triangle Strategy. However, I did find a lot of things tedious in the end. So I haven't actually completed all the different story routes and scenarios. I just did the golden route. I might try to return and do the other story routes, but I got a little fatigued at the end of this game, I'll admit. But yeah, I would tentatively recommend this game for those who do like tactical RPGs as well as interesting choice-driven narratives. But just don't approach this game too overhyped. It was interesting. I just kind of wish that they did a few things better. And again, if they were to make a sequel, hopefully they'll resolve some of those issues I just talked about. All right, so those were the 3 games that I recently played and completed that I want to discuss with you guys. Let me know if you played any of these and what your thoughts were. For January, I have quite an ambitious lineup of games I want to at least start this month. With Fire Emblem Engage coming out, that's sort of my highlight that I'm very much looking forward to. But before that comes out, I want to finish up my Shin Megami Tensei 4 game on the 3DS that I had to put on pause when some of these other games started coming out. So I'm looking forward to playing more of that game and hopefully finishing it up before Fire Emblem comes out, which might not be possible, but we'll see. But yeah, let me know what you guys have been playing recently or what you're looking forward to in January. And until my next video, bye guys.